Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you to both in-person and online participants for joining our book launch and learn event today. My name is Zhixi Zhuang. I'm the Associate Professor at the School of Urban and Regional Planning at TMU, and also the Academic Director of the Toronto Metropolitan Centre for Immigration and Settlement, the so-called TMCIS. TMCIS is the host of today's event. And we also run our monthly Lunch and Learn event. And because this event is about book launch, and so we call it Book Launch and Learn event. And TMCIS is a university-based research center. You can consider it as a knowledge hub and a community space. We are committed to fostering academic and community collaboration and open dialogue to enrich critical local, regional, and global discourses in the field of migration and refugee studies. Before we get started, I'd like to first acknowledge the land. We stand on the traditional dish with one spoon territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. As settlers, and we are sharing this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land. I'm an immigrant myself, and as a migration scholar, I also, it's on an ongoing reflection on truth and reconciliation. By acknowledging the land, I think as scholars, students, and practitioners in the field of migration studies, we are all reminding ourselves of our human connection and responsibility to care for the land. Let's work together towards truth and reconciliation and reimagine the future of the land together. Today's event will serve as the book launch for the amazing book, The Canadian Nonprofit Sector, Neoliberalism and the Assault on Community, co-authored by Ted Richmond and John Shields. The co-authors are with us today, together with a group of amazing panelists from the nonprofit settlement sector. This event is co-sponsored by TMU's Department of Politics and Public Administration and Fernwood Publishing. We have set up the book table later on after the event, and feel free to do book signing and networking after the event. And there's also a discount for both in-person and online audience. And if you wish to purchase the book, it's wonderful. It's a beautiful book. And I've heard that just from one of the audience here, it has been promoted through the Ontario Nonprofit Network, and people are citing your book. Congratulations. I would like to first introduce John and Ted, and then Ted will do the introduction of our panelists. Dr. John Shields is a professor emeritus in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at TMU. He was the past director of the Ontario Metropolis Centre and past managing editor of the Journal of International Migration and Integration. He was also a board member and board chair of Access Employment, a nonprofit agency specializing in immigrants' employment, and his research and publishing have been focused on immigration and settlement policy practice, labor market policy, and nonprofit sector studies. He's been actively working with community-based researchers and the networks, and he's the co-editor of the book entitled Precarious Employment, Causes, Consequences, and Remedies, and also a co-editor of a forthcoming book about social resilience and the urban migrant experience. Congratulations, John. Ted has over 30 years of experience in community-based research and especially related to immigrant and refugee settlement and diversity and equity and inclusion. And he has developed multi-stakeholder inclusion initiatives, conducted workforce surveys, has also published extensively on service implications of changing and racial demographics, relations between government and community service providers, and the dynamics of equity and social inclusion. And co-edited the book, Social Inclusion, Canadian Perspectives. Ted was an instructor with the Chang School at TMU for over 15 years and in teaching in the certificate program for nonprofit management. And over to you, Ted. You can introduce our panelists.
So, first of all, Axelle Janczur is ED at Accents Alliance Multicultural Community Health Center in Toronto. She's been an important and influential advocate for the needs of vulnerable and marginalized communities, including racialized groups and non-status newcomers. Her agency has consistently developed community research initiatives and related internships to support these communities. Axelle also teaches on the nonprofit sector at the Schulich Business School at York University. And Axelle, as you know, contributed the foreword for our book. Maureen Fair is ED of West Neighborhood House, formerly St. Christopher, a large multi-service agency serving various communities in downtown Toronto. She's always been a strong advocate for not only better services for diverse communities, but also for improvements in the amount and types of funding available to nonprofits. Like Axelle, Maureen has pioneered and championed community research initiatives. Her agency commissioned many such projects involving community members directly in identifying issues as well as gathering and analyzing data. Mwarigha is VIP of Housing, Homelessness, Asset Sustainability, and New Development at Wood Green Community Center. He has worked in nonprofit and community housing for many years. His previous roles include General Manager of Peel Housing Corporation and a management role at Toronto Community Housing. Mwarigha is an important thought leader in relation to the nonprofit sector with an innovative and quote-unquote outside-the-box perspective. He has developed fresh perspectives on partnership and sustainability in nonprofit housing, and often participates in pan-Canadian discussions to develop these perspectives. And as I will mention in my remarks later on, Mwarigha has been instrumental in developing a more robust understanding of the needs of immigrant communities at different stages of the settlement process.
I think I'm going to lead off in terms of some comments and talk a bit about the book first. And then we'll turn it over to Ted, and then we're going to go to our community-based panelists. And first of all, I do want to thank Zhixi and Emery, who's worked tirelessly behind the scene to make this happen, and also to the Department of Politics. I see you over there, Tuna. Thank you for contributing to this event and being a co-sponsor, and of course to Fernwood Books. This would not be possible without the efforts of Fernwood, and particularly Errol Sharp, who's one of the founders of Fernwood. And I very much look forward to hearing our three wonderful community speakers coming up shortly. Also, I just want to thank everybody who's come to the out today. This was not a good start to the day in terms of the weather. So thank you for braving it out here. And also, there's quite a few people who are online, and I know who couldn't quite make it to the event, but who've turned up for that. So thank you, everybody, for your support in that way. Next slide, please. Now, one of the key things that we do try to do in the book, one of its purposes, was to try to provide a critical analysis of the role of nonprofit, especially service-providing organizations, and of course, agencies that serve immigrants are a very important part of that community in these kind of neoliberal times. I think the timing of the book is really quite interesting and important because we've just, of course, come through the pandemic, and there was the promise during the pandemic to build back better, and we seem to be retreating very rapidly from that today. We're living in much, I think, bleaker times, and certainly we see that in terms of the immigrant sector with the announcement of a cutback of 20% in the number of permanent newcomers to the country, which is sending, I think, a little bit of a shockwave to those organizations that are serving immigrants in our community in terms of how they're going to readjust. And all of this is happening in a time when more and more demands are being placed overall on the nonprofit sector. You know, one of the things we do attempt to do in the book is talk about the relevance of neoliberalism in terms of understanding this, and do a critique of neoliberalism. We look at the nonprofit sector as the organizational face of civil society, and identify the important service role that nonprofits play, but also the advocacy, the voice role that they play within society, and that those two things really cannot be separated, that they're really one. They need to go together. They are one and the same. So the nonprofit sector is a space where social justice and democracy thrive. They are the glue that helps bind our communities together. And I think it's really important to understand and to recognize that. And if the nonprofit sector is facing challenges, all of society is in fact facing challenges. Next slide, please. Yep. And so one of these things is we do need to understand neoliberalism. And one of the things the book does is try in an understandable way to set forth why it's important to understand and to acknowledge the impact of neoliberalism on society, but also more importantly for this book on the nonprofit sector. And I'm not going to read that whole quote there, but neoliberalism is really about increasing the marketization of society. It's about cutting social supports. Its policies result in growing inequality and growing polarization within society. And it's about shifting risk onto individuals, families, and communities. It's about, to use a phrase from those of you who might remember back when, C.B. McPherson from the U of T way back when used the phrase possessive individualism, but possessive individualism over community. And so neoliberalism, I think, is all about those sorts of things. And we do try to spend some time examining that within the book. Next slide, please. Now, I think one way to get a grasp of this neoliberal impact is to consider one of the core themes that we discuss in the book, and that is nonprofit precarity alongside nonprofit resilience. You know, there's a Janus face, if you will, to the community nonprofit sector. And there's a real, I think, value of exploring that dichotomy that exists within the sector between precariousness and resilience. I think it's very revealing. And neoliberalism continues to shape the sector's precariousness and the direction of its resilience. Now, what's precarity about? Well, in basic terms, precarity is about insecurity. It's about uncertainty. It's about instability. It's about enhanced risk within society. And the sector, the nonprofit sector, demonstrates precarity in a number of ways. On the one hand, it's the sector provides services to precarious populations. It provides a bit of a safety net to that sector, but it's a precarious safety net, ironically. Secondly, its own workforce is precarious because of underfunding and the lack of adequate benefits and competitive wage structures that exist in the sector because of the nature of its funding, at least for most of the sector. And nonprofit organizations themselves are precarious because of the nature of their funding model. Just as they run on the basis of just-in-time operations. Next slide, please. Now, what about neoliberalism's role in fostering nonprofit precarity? Well, one way it's done this over the years has been through new public management, NPM, which is, imposing a business approach to the structuring and the management of nonprofit service operations. And so there's a constructed precarity that comes to exist within the sector as a result of this. It normalizes the imposition of restructuring and austerity. And it becomes very much a transition belt for the normalization of neoliberal ideas within the sector. Brian Evans, who's in the audience, and I have done some writing around this over the last, over many years. Now, during crises like COVID-19, precariousness is magnified and resilient responses are called upon. But what is resilience then? So a limited definition of resilience is about the ability to withstand. It's about the ability to adapt, to recover from a crisis. And the nonprofit sector has long been considered a resilient sector because of its ability to adjust and to adapt. But I think what we have to understand is that there's different types of resilience. And one dominant framing of resilience is the idea of neoliberal resilience. As one author has, I think, tellingly framed it, neoliberal resilience is about the ability to resiliently endure. For the nonprofit sector, it's about doing more with less, the ability to operate under continuous stress. Neoliberal resilience is very individually centered and closely connected to responsibilization approaches to policy and the downloading of risks onto individuals, families, and communities. And associated with neoliberalism and its hyper-competitive, individualized, market-centered idea of public policy, those kinds of approaches are very much associated with this idea of neoliberal resilience. Individuals and communities are held responsible increasingly for their own well-being. And resilience in this way also becomes to be very depoliticized. The focus is upon maintaining the status quo within society. Next slide, please. Now, neoliberal restructuring has forced a state of what I would call everyday resilience onto the nonprofit sector, compelling nonprofits to manage through their precarity, a situation leaving the sector to stretch its resources, to intensify work, to adapt, and to innovate for survival in a process of continuous struggle. Nonprofits are not able to adequately invest in future sustainability, and their overall capacity is eroded in the everyday struggle to survive. So it does work against, I would say, and Ted and I would say, against long-term sustainable forms of resilience. But there is another kind of resilience, and it's a more progressive form of resilience that often is talked about as transformative resilience or social resilience. And it's not just about bouncing back, but about bounding forward. It's about building back better, if you will, with a social justice-based orientation. And, I've been doing some work on another project with Valerie Preston from York University as part of a grant called Building Back Migrant Resilience in Cities. And we actually have a couple of edited books coming out in the near future that tries to explore social resilience and look at the immigrant experiences in Ontario and Quebec in relationship to that. Next slide, please. Now, resilience, therefore, is not just about everyday survival, but it's about struggle. It's about resistance. It's about progressive intervention and reinvention. Social resilience moves beyond an individual orientation focusing on relational dynamics, including the key role that institutions, and I think most importantly here, that nonprofits, including settlement-based organizations, play in shaping social inclusion in society. This approach emphasizes the active and dynamic over the passive, the importance of challenging power relations and structures of inequality. The transformative capacities and potentialities of individuals, of groups, of communities, and of social institutions like nonprofits are very much brought to the fore in this way. Next slide, please. Hence, the dichotomy and the dynamics of precariousness and resilience of the nonprofit sector in an era of neoliberalism is one I think that is very revealing. Neoliberalism presses to maintain a community nonprofit sector in a state of constructed precariousness as a thinly resourced protective social layer for highly vulnerable communities and promoting the offloading increasingly of responsibilities onto those communities and onto the nonprofit sector to deal with growing social deficits. Imagine Canada back in 2018, before the pandemic, actually said that by 2026, which is not very far away, obviously, that there would be a social deficit of about $26 billion that nonprofit organizations needed to be able to fill the gap for vulnerable people and for Canadian society in general. And of course, that has grown considerably. And the question is the sector able to do that, to fill that gap when they're already struggling in terms of the responsibility that's been added to them? So neoliberalism really does seek to uphold a restrictive form of resilience that squeezes the nonprofit sector to do more with less in the support of ever more precarious communities. It really is a Band-Aid type of approach, and I would say it's a Band-Aid without a lot of sticky left in the Band-Aid itself. By contrast, social resilience opens pathways for transformative possibilities, challenging the dominance of neoliberal policy and with the promise of building back better. Next slide, please. I'm almost done. So what's the current state of the community nonprofit sector? And I'm sure we'll hear a lot more from our community-based speakers here on this. But it is a sector under tremendous pressure, which is still attempting to recover from post-traumatic, post-pandemic and traumatic stresses. There's a real HR crisis in the sector because of the level of pay, the level of benefits that creates insecure workforces. Certainly, the volunteer base has not recovered from pre-pandemic levels, and it was already kind of eroding because of an aging population and the structure that has been produced around volunteers. Finances in the sector are stagnant or falling in the context of rapidly increasing demand. And sector capacity is very much called into question based on this. What is the sustainability of the sector and its operations over the longer term is, I think, a very important question. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, neoliberal governments engage with nonprofits as contracted alternative service delivery agents, not as true partners with voice. A form of what one author has called antagonistic collaboration, a situation perpetuating precarity and subordination by the sector to the neoliberal state. It is the social justice missions, I would argue, that we would argue, including the voice-oriented components of this, that drive nonprofit organizations to be innovative and socially resilient, to contest precarity and to stand up for community interests in a more equitable society. The post-pandemic period has become what the BC nonprofit sector report in 2024 described as less resilient times. During the pandemic, the sector certainly demonstrated that it was resilient and it was effective in its cooperative approach to addressing the crisis. But it also revealed vulnerabilities and the taxing of the resources of the sector and the level of burnout within the sector. A recent report, the 2024 report from the Ontario Nonprofit Network called Building Hope, a nonprofit sector seeking stability, talks about the duality within the sector, duality between hope, which really does come out of the building back better that we saw during the pandemic, that promise, but also the overall mission of nonprofits, which is to do good works, and because they are mission-driven types of organizations. But also on the other hand, the feeling that, in fact, 45% of the sector, according to that report, felt being overwhelmed. Only 41% actually felt optimistic about the current moment. So there's other trends that talk about some of the challenges going forward, and especially in terms of some of the political developments. I think we'll see what happens in the American election coming up. We have a Canadian election at the federal level that will be coming up soon, and it may speak volumes in terms of what's happening. Next slide, please. This is just a list of some of the sources that were cited in the report or in this talk. And the last slide, I do want to thank everybody, but I also wanted to point out a book review. Since it's a favorable review, I wanted to really give an emphasis here. And it was put out by the Philanthropist Journal, but I think it does give a good summary of the book. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ted.
Thank you. Thank you. Am I coming through? Yeah, okay. First, I want to echo John's thanks to the participants, to the panel, and to Fernwood. He's already outlined many of the basic themes of this book. I want to speak to another dimension, which is the sheer diversity of the nonprofit sector. I don't mean just racial and ethnic diversity or the issues often now described as diversity, equity, and inclusion. These remain fundamental along with gender issues. But I'm talking about the broadest sense of diversity in the sector, which encompasses a very wide variety of organizations by funding amount, by legal status, by ratio of paid staff to volunteers, including those that are entirely volunteer driven, by types of service, by mission focus, and in numerous other ways. The definitions of the sector and the terminology used to describe it vary greatly. None of them are very completely satisfactory. Describing it as the charitable sector, for example, as was quite common until recently, leaves out a multitude of organizations that are not registered charities. As well, official statistics can only reflect registered charities and/or incorporated nonprofits, leaving out all the organizations, maybe half of the total, that are neither of those. For many years, one of my favorites, and definitely a favorite of government, was the voluntary sector, with its implications that funding was basically optional. John and I took a broader view. Like others analyzing the sector, we included reasonable estimates of the number and types of nonprofits not reflected in official statistics. But we also examined a number of important subsectors that are not always considered, such as the social economy in Quebec, social finance, the large number of cooperatives across Canada. These are just examples. And the role of Indigenous community organizations and leaders in advocacy. The result, I hope, is a richer and more vibrant portrait of the sector in all of its diversity. Our discussion today focuses on immigrant services in hard times. From a historical perspective, community-based immigrant health and social services have become not only more established, but also more diverse in the last decades and more specialized. How did that happen? 40 years ago, the range of government funding for these services was very narrow. Citizenship and Immigration Canada, now IRCC, recognized the need only for what we call orientation services, believing that a limited knowledge of one official language and familiarity with things like banking and public transit was sufficient for immigrants to have full and equal access to the complete range of public services in Canada. At the same time, those critical of the CIC approach recognized the barriers to public services faced by immigrants, but were locked into a very limited vision of alternative ethnic or multicultural agencies meeting all the public service needs of newcomers. An essential part of moving beyond this situation was changing the understanding of the nature of immigrant services. My friend and colleague Mwarigha laid much of the groundwork by elaborating 3 stages of settlement, including initial orientation as identified by CIC, and midterm adaptation, including housing and schools and healthcare, and above all, initial labor market integration. The 3rd stage of longer-term integration included being welcomed into diverse communities and securing employment commensurate with international training and experience. Ratna Omidvar, now a senator, and I elaborated these stages in the Laidlaw Foundation paper, Immigrant Settlement and Social Inclusion in Canada, which was widely cited for many years. At the same time, we needed to break with the language of ethno-specific or multicultural services as an alternative to the so-called mainstream services. Academics, community leaders like Axelle and Maureen and many others, as well as some sympathetic government people, began to speak of, quote, culturally and linguistically appropriate services. This shift in terminology and equally in understanding achieved 3 goals. It correctly identified the barriers to appropriate services. It legitimized many new types of settlement services, and it opened an essential dialogue about necessary reforms in areas such as healthcare, education, and the labor market. Furthermore, it validated the necessity to fund these essential services, as well as supporting the larger settlement agencies and some of the larger settlement broad community agencies in developing services specific to certain communities, while still remaining broadly accessible. Gradual acceptance of this changed understanding involved persistent education and advocacy. It also involved a truly diverse array of new partnerships, including municipal governments, provincial funders, some foundations, and the metropolis academic government community collaboration. The result has been the diverse network of culturally and linguistically appropriate services that we see today. Perhaps, given the pressures that have already been mentioned on the sector today, these perspectives seem naively optimistic. But certainly has not all been clear sailing, and the waters are likely to get rougher still in the next years. Alfred Lamb from the Center for Immigrant and Community Services in Toronto recently posted his concerns about the growing anti-immigrant sentiment in the public discourse, with newcomers blamed for everything from housing shortages to healthcare bottlenecks. However, I think historical perspective can be important at this stage. I suspect that challenging this will require an extended effort at public discussion, as was done around the nature of settlement and related services. After all, if immigrants are causing all these problems, why should we support them? That's just common sense, right?
Axelle first? Okay. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's exciting. I'm actually on a leave from work right now, which, as I was sort of getting ready for today, I realized how much work helps to organize me. So just, a combination of reasons. But I would say first and foremost, I am a practitioner, and I was reflecting on like Mwarigha and Maureen. It feels like a old school reunion here because it's been many, many years. Maureen and I know each other. We were, okay, I'm going to out us.
Okay.
We were part of a socialist study group many years ago when I think we were both sort of still in schoolish and starting to work and just out of school. And then I was the coordinator at the Center for Spanish Speaking Peoples, which was a collective, which was just a fascinating experience. Everybody has to work in a collective to really cut their teeth. And Maureen was on the board.
The volunteer board was
which was hilarious. Yeah, yeah. Of a unionized collective. It was, yeah. And then I was Maureen's one of Maureen's employment references when she was interviewing for program director at St. Chris, now West Neighborhood House. So, I forgot about that. We were in a feminist managers group that actually we were trying to, improve our practice, but it was more about, eating fries and having beer and bitching about our bosses. But then that fell apart when we started becoming executive directors. And some of us were, and some of us weren't, and they were like these little power dynamics. Yeah, but if there were not EDs that you can, so anyhow, that is so. And then Mwarigha, you and I got to know each other, and it was through some scheme of Ted's. Many. It might have been as far back as when Ted was at Ocasio, or I'm thinking it might have been related to one of our very early community-based research projects at Access Alliance, which goes way, way back. So anyhow, yeah, it's nice, nice to be here. And I guess my first point then is, the present does build on the past. This is an amazing resource, and as eloquent as John and Ted are, there's nothing new, like the neoliberalism is our current narrative in the sector and has been for quite some time. Ted and John are amazing thinkers and practitioners with years of experience and thoughtful reflection, so are moving the discourse forward. And I think, within the context of the comments you made about resilience and, needing to center social action as part of that, focus and commitment to, moving the needle on all of these critical issues, we have to, keep evolving this narrative. Reflecting again on, so I'm a practitioner. I've worked in the sector always. My entire professional practice has been working in the not-for-profit and primarily immigrant services sector. I also teach at York, and so every semester I will review my reading list. And there's an article that Ted wrote in 2004, Community Service Organizations at Risk. So this is 20 years old. And every year I look at that and I go, okay, it's old. It's old. I need to refresh. So I'm always refreshing my reading list. But I have never been able to quite let that one go, because if you read that article, and so maybe we should do a project to like modernize it and refresh it, but the core of it is still valid today within, the context of what we're discussing. So, okay, I'm locating myself in time. Ted and Lynn Eakin, who was the co-author in that instance, talked about the impact of funding practices and erosion of capacity. And at that time, talking about grants versus contracts, I'd say that continues, has been exacerbated. And in fact, now added to it is the whole focus on social enterprise as if it was a new thing, right? So now social enterprise and the entry of schools like, Rotman School of Business, and I mean, York too, although I haven't seen York, Schulich do this big push on CSR and social enterprises to that extent yet, although sustainability for sure, lack of funding administration, the swear word that is overhead, if you can't count it, if you can't demonstrate it as a service, it's not funded. Advocacy chill. And again, I say, notwithstanding that we not-for-profits, we position ourselves in terms of what are the systemic issues, because we know we're, you said Band-Aid, we know we're a drop in the bucket in terms of addressing these issues, that we have to be driving or attempting to drive systemic change. You know, if we think of, you know, dominant structures, systemic discrimination, oppression, all of these things, challenge of accountability is still a really critical issue, especially if you look at who are our traditional partners, our funding partners, government in particular, who keep changing the rules. You know, you talked about, you know, lack of stability. It's because they're changing the rules all the time. And it's not even a, okay, stop everybody, we're changing the rules. It's like, no, we're running. And by the way, the rules have changed. And I'm going to give one example, which is, I still can't quite wrap my head around it. Okay, you guys will agree with me. A tried and true rule was you never spend before you have a signed contract. You never deliver services that aren't funded. Like, this was a rule. We would, and then we would all suffer because some government funders would, you know, be late getting us our funded contracts, and we'd have to have, you know, the pink slips ready for staff, like all of this. But that was a rule for the majority of my professional life, you know, which is significant. And in the last 2 years, this has changed horrifically. And, you know, I'm just going to put out there, Ministry of Health, where so much public dollars are spent in the not-for-profit sector. Think hospitals, think community health centers, think senior services, think mental health, think all of these services. We are now being pushed to spend. We've been given assurances, and we've been told to deliver services, and we have no signed contracts. You don't get money till middle to end of fiscal year. So this is just one example of how the rules are changing. So, you know, the challenge of accountability, and then, you know, the bigger getting bigger, the smaller struggling. This article referenced like the integration imperative. I would say that integration imperative now has evolved into the social enterprise imperative. How do we have these public-private partnerships, not-for-profit partnerships? How do we generate money? Generating money, you know, you talked about marketization of society. You know, which is so interesting because market failure is one of the reasons for the existence of not-for-profit organizations. You know, you can't market. There's no money to be made in poverty. There's no money to be made in child protection. There's no money to be made in violence against women. And yet we're saying we have to figure out ways to make money, to partner with private sector. So notwithstanding how good corporate citizens they are, they still, you know, why are they in it? They're in it to make money. It can be, you know, all good. We can all be on board about mission, but this, you know, again, neoliberalism is our current narrative, and making money and charging for services is nothing new in the sector. We have been doing this. So again, you know, the present builds on the past. What's old is new again. And so many of these organizations, in fact, were so hard hit during COVID. Daycare, recreation organizations, all kinds of services that charge even minimum amounts were slammed and drastically affected. And as a result, services were also drastically affected during COVID, which right there shows one of the many, many flaws in the whole marketization of the sector. So, you know, again, we're building this. How do we break out? I have to say, I tried to be very positive. I have to be positive. You know, in the forward, I talked about, you know, for so years, I was like, I'm a great administrator. If I can just manage better, if I can just run this organization better, let's have good planning. Let's have good evaluation. Let's use our data. Let's have great human resources. Let's have good labor relations. Let's do all of this. But that's not enough, especially when none of that is funded. Maybe before it was even a little bit funded, it is less funded, especially within social enterprise narrative. You know, none of this is measurable. None of this is, you know, how do you demonstrate impact? Although I would encourage you to look at all of the community-based organizations that have experienced in the last 10 years significant labor relations challenges, organizations that are so mission-focused, that are doing, you know, what I call the righteous work. You know, all my life, every day I've gotten up and said, you know, it's our mission that keeps me going. It's our mission that inspires me. We are doing this righteous work. But, you know, today's generation of workers are not prepared to suck it up and to deliver services on our backs, our unpaid labor. And, good for them, because I, unfortunately, given my generation, have perpetuated this unhealthy and unrealistic equation. I was willing for so long to work, but people are not prepared to work in these conditions of employment, nor should they. And that's another example of some of the precarity we're seeing, where people are saying, and again, it's related to social justice. How can we advocate for basic income, a basic income or living wage when our staff in our organizations are not making the $25, what is it, $25.70 now? We have tons of staff that are not making that money. So how can we can no longer do the work we do, the mission work we do on the backs of our staff, our employees. It speaks to the importance of mission. It speaks to the magnitude of the social problems that we are facing. The Imagine Canada did talk about the social deficit, which is fully here. They used to talk about the looming or impending. It is here. There is no market answer for these. How do we challenge this? I don't know. I'm striving to be positive and striving to be progressive, but I think, this is not, happenstance. This is intentional government policy. And I think you referred to it, we play not-for-profit organizations play a critical role in society, but we are controlled by this framework within which we are all operating. And, we are tolerating. I used to have a colleague, Russ Ford, who was an old activist. He never stopped being an old activist. And we would have these meetings, and he would keep saying, we have to march on Queen's Park. We have to all go on strike. We have to stop delivering our services. We have to, in fact, create a terrible social crisis so that, we can't accept these conditions. And we're not there. I don't even know if I'm there as a radical and progressive force as I think I am. I really do look to the new generations of our staff who are in fact more educated or have a greater lived experience that's going to give them a greater edge to truly challenge some of these frameworks within which we still operate. As much as we're all committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI has now become another acronym, like multiculturalism used to be, and then cultural competency. We are not like the dominant structures are still not. We still are not challenging, even in the most basic way, these critical dominant structures. There are so many frameworks. I was just reading another book that Ted helped write or co-authored or something, was with Uzma Shaker, who was, again, an activist in the sector who now is working in Peel. And she talked about being a proponent of targeted universalism. And I'm going to end on this note, which I think is relevant because bringing this back to immigrant services, immigrant services about those folks who are most disadvantaged, who are made most vulnerable by systemic barriers and who experience the impacts. And targeted universalism is about making those changes which are specifically about addressing those, the remedies for those folks who are most vulnerable. And that we know, in fact, is good for all of society. So I'm hoping that, concepts like that will be taken up in terms of some of our thinking going forward. But in the meantime, read the book. It's very succinct. Buy it for all your staff. Have study groups in your workplace, and get your board to read it too, because we need them on board for sometimes some of the things we want to do. Who is next?
Thanks. Lots of pieces I'd love to pick up on, but I'll stick to my notes for now. And if there's chance to riff later, we will. I really wanted to start by thanking Ted and John for this book. I think it's a great textbook for our staff, our board, our sector. I think there's a lot of people who work in our sector who are not aware of this analysis of neoliberalism. I think it's a bit of a slogan of lefties that they don't buy into. And I think we've got to impress upon them the importance of understanding the political context we're in. I do believe neoliberalism is mainstream, and I think we've got to recognize that we're part of it in many ways. So as much as I agree with the analyses in this book, I think I'd like to poke into some of the dilemmas that have been raised in the book. And I'll start with funding reform, which is a file I've worked on with the Ontario Not-for-Profit Network for over a decade, sometimes with Ted. And I don't think we got very far. I don't think we're getting very far, though there's a few signs of hope. So the first part of this poking around at this dilemma for me is, who should be paying for not-for-profit work? It's not actually obvious who it is. We're not self-sustaining in any way. So our choices are: the community pays via program fees and fundraising, or the market and business pays, again, maybe through fees, but also increasingly through impact investing, where they are extracting profit out of us somehow, even though I don't see how they can, because I don't think there's been any sector more efficient than our sector, and our auditors often testify to that. Our auditors often say, you have the most complex books, there's nothing fat here at all. You guys are as lean as you could be. I don't think we tout that enough. I don't think that's broadcast enough at all. And so the final choice is really government via grants. So focusing on government, if we accept government funding, because it feels like we have to, coming with all the controls with it and the usual cookie cutter approach to all the diverse communities for services, aren't we then complicit in a paternalistic, or because of the gender thing in our sector, maternalistic service delivery? Aren't we complicit in shielding government from accountability? Aren't we complicit in having risk passed from government and markets to individuals and to our organizations? It's really difficult choice to take government funding, but I think we're often doing it unthinkingly, and I would challenge ourselves to really think about that closely. Our options are to obviously could refuse government funding, and then we would face enormous financial losses and loss of staff and losses of connections to the community, because service delivery really is a way that people get involved with us. Or we could push for the government to directly deliver at least some of the services themselves. And I don't think we've had adequate discussions about that. And certainly the public service unions have a bit of an internal conflict too, about what should be delivered by government with good jobs and what should be delivered by the not-for-profit sector. And isn't it appalling that the government can fund themselves to deliver a program and also fund the sector to deliver a program, and the salary difference is sometimes 20% or more different for staff doing the exact same work? And that's why we've talked before about equal pay for equal work. It has a whole new meaning in that context. And then the other option is to push ourselves as not-for-profits to experiment with new ways of working with community that meet our shared service delivery goals. People want jobs, people want to get out of violent situations. So there are shared service goals we have with government and the community. But while we do good old community development work to empower people to hold government accountable for the way that money has been flowing to their supports. We'd have to push ourselves harder as a sector to do much more advocacy for funding that does not drive us to cookie cutter and paternalistic or maternalistic service delivery models. And to be effective in our advocacy, I think that we need to tune in much more to Sam or Maria, average taxpayer, who earns apparently about $49,000 a year in salary is the average for a Canadian. And they more than likely, and we've heard this, feel some resentment when they see their tax contributions going to salaries and benefits of much better paid management folks in our sector. They see it on the Sunshine List. They also feel permanently temporary or temporarily permanent. I can never get it right. That's not just in the not-for-profit sector. That's in the market sector, even more so, I would say. In service industries, they are not hanging on to jobs with any sense of security any more than we are. Sam and Maria, average taxpayer, are also really confused about us being the voluntary sector. They, why are they getting paid? We thought you were volunteers. And they often do not have an analysis of what neoliberalism is, or they dismiss it as a lefty slogan. They're not dumb folks, the taxpayers. They're not callous folks generally. They are genuinely puzzled and concerned why social conditions seem to be deteriorating, frankly, rapidly and visibly, and they're wondering what the heck their tax dollars and donations have been going to when the homeless and immigrants who are homeless on the streets of Toronto now, Peter Street and Queen and Bathurst and Sherbourne, where has all that money been going if this is what's the result? So I think we need to work with Sam and Maria taxpayer proactively about the root causes of poverty and what not-for-profits can do and cannot do to address these social conditions. There's other dilemmas like the data deficit that I really appreciate you guys raising in the book. I will just comment briefly that I am concerned about the quality of a lot of the surveys I'm asked to do. I feel like they're asking leading questions about the demand for services and the need for more funding. Of course, we have an incentive to ask, to say that we need it. It's an incentive to ask for more. So I think we need to be a lot more careful about our surveys and our use of them. And I really, really challenge us to keep using rhetoric like ever increasing need. It underlines again that sense that we're not doing any good, that we're not making any progress. And that's not true. The introduction of the child tax benefit has lifted a ton of people, a ton of families out of poverty. And we've got to recognize those successes and take some credit for them. It was advocacy by our sector that led the way for some of that. If there's 2 seconds more, dilemma, another one is the competition for fundraising and funding. We see ourselves as a sector. We need to plan as a system that's just as important as the market system, just as important as the government system. And I don't think we do that. I think we keep looking like we are beholden to them. And one funder notoriously many years ago said, "You look like dogs fighting for scraps under the table." It's really terrible image. And I will question the expansion and growth model of many not-for-profits. When is it kind of domestic imperialism and it's very extractive? Are we making room for new organizations with new leadership? And I would urge us to follow the dish with one spoon treaty principle of take what you need and leave some for the others. I'll end on that, but Mayor Chow recently challenged the Toronto Not-for-Profit Network that our advocacy is shallow. So I'm speaking out. I can get our board to speak out. Some of our senior staff can speak out. But if the microphone is put in front of our frontline staff or our volunteers or our participants, are they really engaged in advocacy? Do they really know the nuances of what we're asking? And I would say we're not. So we need to deepen advocacy all through our organizations.
Ted, what did you want me to talk about? Anyway, I was very excited to be invited here today, partly because this is a conversation that we've had, especially between the three of us over the last 25 years or so. But most of that conversation used to take place in a pub. So when I saw the address, I thought there would be a pub somewhere close by, only to come and find that it was a very formal setting. So in any case, okay. And then I just want to also, for me, it was exciting to come because of and in particular, I want to just say, very, very happy for Ted and John for having completed this book. Because throughout the process, even as he says about some of my contribution to the immigrant settlement spectrum and journey, His mentorship meant a lot to me, coming out of university and being a newcomer. I remember going to his office and I said, I have this big research project. Where do I begin? And, I wasn't told to sit down in the office. I was told, I'm going to pick up my son, Sean. So would you mind coming and taking a ride with me? So, and we did that a lot of times. So it's been a human experience for me. But I bring that up because coming out of school, I could have been as a new immigrant with very little sort of antenna of what life is like outside university. I could have been many other things when I look back, and I do sometimes. But immersing myself with Ted and subsequently growing into the nonprofit sector with a very intentional understanding, I started to realize what it meant to me. And in some ways, I want to share that because as a new immigrant, I want to highlight a couple of things. First of all, it's a process through which many of us who are strangers to this country begin to connect to its core values and what it means to transition to be a Canadian and to begin to connect to a new community. We all come from different families, from different countries, but when we come here, we connect to a different community. And that's a community that's multicultural. It's not necessarily primarily based on lineage. And the nonprofit sector is an organizational form that allows us to express and connect to that sense of community. We start to understand the fundamentals of things like universal healthcare, which is in this country provided primarily, in fact, exclusively up until now, through the nonprofit sector, even though we don't remember that to be true. And that begins to help one understand the shared values and the need to have this collective pot of taxes through which we provide for everybody and guarantee some basic healthcare element. You take the field of housing, for example, as well, and it's also laced with the similar kinds of principles. How do we end the problem of homelessness? How do we deal with issues of income, mental health, and the things that cause people to struggle in life normally, and make that not just a family and a relatives problem, but make that a community problem. And I think when I began to understand those things, I began to understand what the responsibility of being an immigrant was for me. And in fact, began to understand that in fact, when you're an immigrant, the process isn't about settlement per se. It's about a journey to integration. And that's what inspired me in writing about that. So I want all of us to understand, like from an immigrant perspective, that is how I understand the nonprofit sector as an instrument, as an organizational instrument. That's not like calling up your family friends or creating a fundraiser, an ad hoc fundraising session, and creating an organizational infrastructure in this country that has been a defining character in what being a Canadian is. And so making that connection. Today, of course, as highlighted in the book, marketization through the neoliberal phase has redefined who we are as Canadians and citizens. Today's news was about the $200 check that's coming to every Canadian. And we'll all accept the check, it'll be in the mail, we'll use it and so on and so forth. But it is part of that process where that $200 check should have gone to a collective pot that is then part of the funding part for nonprofits that allows us to make decisions about the priorities of how we want to use our tax dollars, right? So that's how far we've come. And the book talks about marketization through the nonprofit sector. But when it gets to the level where even it's also individualized, you can understand the gravity of the problem and the distance that we're going to have to travel to try and reverse those kinds of things, because they will undermine our ability to continue to provide all those universal services that we've talked about, health, affordable housing, and so on and so forth. The second point I wanted to talk about is the nonprofit sector is also a significant player in providing the necessary stewardship for public money when it has to be applied at the community level. One of the biggest problems we have today, of course, we know, is affordable housing. The housing market went berserk in the last 10 years and created a rent profile in our society that is way beyond our incomes in general. It became a speculative market. Now we're trying to find a solution, and I'm the first one to tell you that the interest rates actually saved our real estate industry and our housing. It has provided us with an opportunity to reset that button and begin to focus on affordability. But in focusing on affordability, one of the things that we're fighting for, and we're making some inroads, is to suggest that you can't solve this problem through a private market solution, and that intervening between the market and the people that need housing is the role of nonprofits as the stewards of affordability. Nobody else will guarantee you 99 years of affordable housing unless it is an entity, even if you don't have a romantic sense of what a nonprofit is, that actually has a business model that says society, the stewardship of public money in order to use it for its purpose of providing affordable housing is our primary mission. And that's what the nonprofit sector has meant. And thirdly, I want to just highlight that one of the critical drivers of the nonprofit sector is voluntarism. And I've over the years, I've gone through this and that about where we are at with voluntarism. And I've come to the conclusion much lately that there is a lot of potential in that scope. There's a lot of young people who believe in voluntarism. Just last week, I chair an organization called Homeless Connect Toronto, and we have an event where we have close to 1,000 homeless people that come to the former Maple Leaf Gardens, and we have a whole plethora of services and connections that we support, and that event is supported by over 500 volunteers that provide concierge services. We have an oversubscribed a list of people who want to volunteer, most of them young and energetic, and are just looking for that glue that makes this a sustainable thing so that it's not a one-day thing. So that potential is there. We're seeing new forms of organization coming even in the housing sector through the land trust movement that is now part of, in my view, the next generation of the non-profit housing and public and community stewardship of community wealth. So there's significant silver lining that's there for us to work with. So I just want to say that there are a couple things, however, that as a nonprofit sector that we need to take responsibility for. One of them is in the effort to fight cutbacks and also then begin to cut back the services. We also forgot to tell people about what we do. So we have a generation of young people who actually don't understand what affordable housing is and how it is run and how rewarding it can be on a day-to-day basis coming to work and being part of the nonprofit. So I think that's the biggest part of the human resource deficit, and that is even providing an awareness that we are a rewarding sector to work in. I think that's I'm not going to replay the data deficit. Maybe the highlight for me to finish is a couple other things. One, we're still very afraid of doing some consolidation and some collaboration. So there's work to be done there. And the biggest tragedy for me today, more than in a period of 15 years, is to observe a trend where the conversation about equity, which is also raised in the book through the discussion on the indigenous community and the Black movement, but it's bigger than that. Our cities are falling apart. The level of segregation that is now evident in our city, partly driven by that privatization of the privatization of the real estate market, is appalling. And so areas like Jane Finch, areas like Scarborough, continue to fall back and form almost a different country. If you drive along Finch from one side to the other, it has the vibe of a developing country more and more. Different from if you drive along St. Clair or the east-west corridors, closer to the downtown. And I think that is not the outcome we want. And the nonprofit sector is a significant factor that governments and even the private sector, by the way, in some ways is beginning to recognize. Don't try and tell us to solve the housing problem. That is for you, and that's for the nonprofit sector for you to anchor that solution. So I think those are my comments. By the way, I'm not a VIP. Unless he meant a very impotent person, but I don't think that's what he meant. I am the vice president for housing and homelessness at Wood Green. So, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
So comments now?
We can open up for questions. Maybe we'll start with the in person, then there may be some questions from the online.
Hi, thank you so much. This book I'm a graduate student, and this is precisely what I'm researching and what my research is all about. So hello, there we go. Hello. Okay, just to reiterate, thank you so much for this book and for your comments and your insights. It's provided a lot of food for thought around my own personal research, which is very much on the neoliberalization of the nonprofit sector. My question for you is the relationship between, or your thoughts on the relationship between neoliberalism and the conceptualization of the nonprofit industrial complex, which is a framework or a lens or conceptualization of the nonprofit sector that I really don't see that much in the Canadian context. Perhaps you could share resources where I could find that myself. But my question for you is why? Why a lack of a discussion around thinking about the nonprofit sector as the nonprofit industrial complex? Oh, sorry, side note, especially considering a lot of your comments and discussion around the need for advocacy.
Maybe I'll try to answer that. Probably because the idea of a nonprofit industrial complex is controversial. So it's not, necessarily accepted that it is industrial complex. I've seen a few articles that have talked about it, and certainly the way that in fact, we even address a little bit about that in the conclusion of the book. I'm not sure we called it an industrial complex. But it suggests that the sector in some ways is completely and totally absorbed into the neoliberal order. And in many ways, I think it is because of the structures of funding and so forth. But it also has its own agency. And, I think that's also why we talked about the idea of progressive notions of resilience. There is still a voice within the sector. There are people who are very dedicated within the sector that are looking, obviously to help people, but they're also looking for broader alternatives. And so I think the idea of a nonprofit industrial complex creates a rather rigid structure. And I think it's a more dynamic type of process that happens here, which is not to deny all the neoliberal influences on the sector and how it can distort things. But I think there's a lot more agency and a lot more hope in terms of the transformative capacities or possibilities of the sector.
I can give you two references. It'd be hard to find, but Pat Capone wrote about this in the 1980s and 90s in Now magazine. And she called it the poverty industry critique. And many of us have hung on to that critique and tried to ensure it's reflected, in our thinking to avoid that. The other one on the international development scale about Canadian international development agencies is Paved with Good Intentions. It's also a Fernwood publication. And then I've just recently heard about When Helping Hurts. And it's an analysis of Christian charities, I think in the States, and how things go sideways, even with the best intentions.
Thank you.
So I think I've never actually thought about it exactly in that way. So I'm got some reading to do. But Ted talked about the diversity of the organization of the sector, and you also talked about the choice that not-for-profits can make whether or not to accept government funding. And I wonder sometimes for organizations whether they understand that as a choice or not, and what the impact of, in fact, not. But the reality is, 90 or 95% of nonprofit organizations are small, less than $2 to $3 million. And many of these are truly that quintessential voluntary, on the ground, grassroots, doing super meaningful work. And I would say that those organizations are also why, I certainly don't think about, because, the sector as this sort of industrial complex, because on the ground, these grassroots organizations, and again, if you think about the work they do, the survivor-led organizations, the capacity building, the food security, even if you think about the huge number of ambassadors that were recruited and deployed during the pandemic, the majority of whom were community members who community members who stepped up. That is a huge piece of the work that is taking place, which doesn't get airplay. There's no big dollars behind it, so I think that's an aspect of it.
I just want to add one thing without trying to get at the whole analysis. It's an example that we talk about more in the book, but I think it's an important example in terms of kind of a test in terms of our generalizations about the nature of the sector. The example is Greenpeace and Amnesty International. They have no government funding. They've structured themselves that way, and they're devoted entirely to advocacy. And they're very, very important parts of the Canadian nonprofit sector and internationally. Amnesty, I think most people know, is very important internationally. Greenpeace actually started in Canada. So I think we need to, that's why I was talking about diversity, that I think that we need to be careful about schemes that don't include elements that are as important as that.
Thank you.
That's okay. Okay, I won't. No, I think this has been a really exciting discussion and it's overdue. Particularly in light of the political circumstances, I think the world, when I say the world, finds itself in with more polarization, with more quick solutions and answers and sloganeering, which really does not help advance much understanding of of the depth and complexity of the issues. And I guess one of the things that I think is a challenge for all of us is the social contract after the Second World War is at an end. I mean, we've all seen that in many, many different ways. And that was such an important breakthrough. We shouldn't presume that there always existed one. There didn't exist one. Every program that we in the legal clinics have worked for and struggled for did not exist 50 years ago. The things that we sometimes even take for granted today, they're not ingrained in any constitution. They're not there forever unless we figure out how to hold on to them and how perhaps even to rewrite them in a way that Sam and Maria buy into. I mean, we need a lot of buy-in when we're talking about tax dollars and we're talking about political policy. So I think we really, I know we're all in different little quarters, you know, and we all have to hold on to day-to-day reality and figure out how to get issues solved. But I think we have to find ways, vehicles, through institutions like universities, but working in partnership with community organizations to think on a bigger level. And we have to get to that level because we need to be in that discourse, or else the politicians will tell us what the solutions are and we will live with them. And I think that a lot of experiments are going on at the community level, like Mwarigha's housing initiative. Walking into the TD Bank and telling them how something can be done takes guts. But I think it's a new way of trying to also approach the complexity of the issues that are maybe some of our old answers don't work anymore. And we have to say, no, they don't. But we're not going down a path that doesn't give people a certain security in society, equal rights, protections, etc. So I think one of the challenges I hear coming out of our discussion today is where do we find the avenues, the vehicles to have those bigger discussions, to come up with some of the ideas that we think are important to protect our communities and to protect the values that we think are important, but won't be, they just won't be maintained the way they were after the Second World War. It's just not going to be that easy. It really is not. I don't see with the complexity we're faced with. So. Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Melody Mason. I should have done that. I'm sorry. I spent many, many years in the legal aid system here in Ontario, in one of the local community centers, working quite closely with the Income Security Advocacy Center, and we worked a lot on very individual issues that were really important in advancing, I think, the role and protection of income programs in Ontario. And we were one of the more, I considered, privileged organizations that were funded to do advocacy. That's not something that's written into most of your contracts. It's not. And in fact, if you're a charity, you had to fight the CRA to make sure you went, you ran that careful line between advocacy and just education of politicians. So yeah, sorry.
About that, thanks, Mel. I just want to bounce off something you said, which makes me think. Sure, the social contract is changing or over, or whatever, but we actually, and I'm trying to counter my previous sort of depressing, I don't know what to do now. Actually, the sector has been responsible for so much change in society. We have so many successes. And I'm, thrilled to see, new generations of students picking up this work, because I do think that and again, going back to, what the president has built in the past, we need to document and learn from these changes and how things happened. And even though I don't want to march on Queen's Park anymore, but, there still is a place to for marching on Queen's Park. So how do we document, so I was going to say, thank you for this. Thank you for future publications that are going to come out. And we have to and disseminate and hold on to the history of the sector and how we have changed society and how we have changed legislation and policy. And so much stuff. And just the last thing is, I am concerned in the age of AI, technology, digital world, that we're losing a lot of our paper artifacts in our organizations. And it's something I've been thinking about. This helps, but I think there's a lot of stuff that we have documented in all of our organizations that we have to figure out how to preserve.
I think one of the things that was really interesting coming out of the pandemic, as horrible as the pandemic was in many ways, was that it's funny how we didn't talk about the problem of austerity or deficits. Actually, it opened up a policy window. And, there was a lot of good, positive talk about building back better and a role for government within society, a positive role for government in society. Now, unfortunately, I think that's all being shut down in a whole variety of ways. There's still some struggle taking place there, but that kind of neoliberalism, unfortunately, is incredibly resilient and is resurrecting in a whole variety of ways. But I think it tells us that there is possibilities for change. There are moments, and we need to seize those moments, and that the struggle is important to put out alternative sort of visions. Most people do not benefit from this overly marketized type of society. A vast majority of people are not benefiting from that, and they do get captured sometimes by an alternative type of vision. And I think we have to be aware of that.
Hi, I'm Brian Evans. I'm a faculty member here at TMU. And given that it's a book launch and I'm an academic and we have a number of academics here, allow me to put the big political question onto the table, which everybody has sort of been touching upon. Melody, I think, made a really important background framing, historically referencing the post-war labor capital compromise. It didn't come from the hand of government voluntarily. It was fought for, pushed for on the picket lines, in the streets, politically, electorally, through electing the right kinds of people to parliaments, legislatures in Europe, in Japan, in North America, and beyond. Like Axelle, I really appreciate your comments about there are no market solutions. I mean, I'm paraphrasing you, but then Maureen offered a solution. Again, I'm paraphrasing you, so forgive me. But essentially, you said, yeah, we need an expanded welfare state. We need more publicly funded services of one type or another, more decommodification, like around housing, like Mwarigha is working on, has put on the table. There are no market solutions. There are none. So then we come back to John's earlier comment, John and Ted, around the resiliency, neoliberal resiliency. Why is it resilient? Because there's nothing threatening it, nothing effectively. Not here anyway, sure, the farmers in India, some other parts of the global south, but here there's nothing particularly threatening. And when you aren't threatened, there is no crisis. It's like your characterization of neoliberalism. It's not wrong, but I find it curious and interesting. You overlook the very nature of the neoliberal state. It's a capitalist state. And it's a class state. And as David Harvey put it a long time ago, that we are living through a class war driven from above. And the main operating platform for that class war is the state, whether it's American, Canadian, whatever. So that's a long-winded way of just saying, so what is the word vehicle came up from Melody and maybe you, Maureen. So what then? Given what we're confronting, and you're all confronting it in your own very particular way, what is a vehicle that we can imagine? Individual nonprofit agencies, yeah, they are points of resistance, but they're really constrained and limited. So then what?
Glad you only asked the simple question.
Maybe I'll start. Yeah, and I think so. It's on. Yeah, I mean that's a really it's a tough question. And it's a tough question because it is true that, we have, the welfare state started in the post-40s, peaked in the early 70s, and has been sort of fighting to claw back and retain relevance with the advency of neoliberalism in the West. And one would have thought that it has peaked and would start the decline. But I think all of us in this room have this fear that there's another level that we are heading to. It's the polls around the election and the national government and what is going to happen are not necessarily pointing in the right direction. They're pointing to a period that's going to be a little bit more worse. And it's all, and these things also catch, demographic cycles. And I talked about the growing conscientization of the youth and the younger generation around the need for a collective, and maybe they won't call it a welfare state, but under the notion of rejecting the 1% notion and so on and so forth. And so I think there's a bit of a demographic conscientization gap that needs to close around that in order to create the critical mass of people that are going to begin through protest, begin through organizing, and so on and so forth. And it's unfortunate that for those of us who have been trying to fight the system and reset it back to that, it just hasn't really played out well. Partly because as a generation, we're also struggling with the benefit side of, being beneficiaries of the system in our own way, having been part of the real estate and the sort of income profile that allowed us to buy houses and so on and so forth. And that, we have in that generation that was created out of that welfare, there's still sufficient wealth to recirculate through our children and so on. And that diminishes the sort of urgency that you see in other parts of the world that young people are exercising. I've just come from a conference in Zanzibar and also in Kenya. And I think you would have caught in the news 3 or 4 months ago, one of the most amazing kinds, which is an indicator of where this whole thing is going in terms of a technologically organized pushback to the state around continuing to take more and more and more and not returning in the form of taxes, in the form of public benefit, what they need to do. And I know that in the news, it played out primarily around some of the violence that occurred and was planted through the state and so on and so forth. But the level of conscientization among young people in that part of the world, and I can't suppose that it's the only place, is unbelievable. They have a way of collecting information about budgets and collecting details about where money is being misspent and circulating it through social media and acting on it in a way that I haven't even seen us arrive here in Canada. And so those are the kind of camaraderie sharing internationally that hopefully will begin to change the inertia that is necessary for governments to do something different.
John, can I just respond to that just very briefly? Just so I'm not misunderstood. So I wasn't a proponent of moving all services over to government by any stretch. In fact, I think that instead of more services, I think we need to be thinking about income. That will lift a lot of people out of needing services. So that's the poverty industry thing, is that everything keeps getting framed around more and more services. That's not always the solution. Many people just need some more money, and that's through income transfers through a progressive tax system.
So how about we collect the questions first, 3 questions in the interest time? Yeah, 1 from the in-person audience and 2 from online. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have been fortunate enough to work with some people that are speaking. and I also read some of the work of Professor Schultz. My name is Elton, and my question is it's a simple one. The word resilience was mentioned a few times during the presentation, and because of the political climate, I think that perhaps we will be moving beyond resilience to resistance. Because based on the political climate today, it seems that more people will be electing policymakers and people in charge that align and who believe in neoliberal policies. So I'm someone moved by solutions other than going beyond the problem. So how do you see actually what are the solutions for us to practice resistance in the near future, like when we first see that things will be getting worse and worse?
Hello? Oh. So a couple of comments from the online audience. We've got one from Susan Brown. She says, thanks for the great session and the wonderful analysis. While it is not a system level solution, those of us who can afford to might want to think about donating those $200 checks from the Ford government to our favorite nonprofits. And then we've got one from Megumi Noteboom, who says she works for a community-based NPO and has noticed that newcomers are often willing to accept underpaid roles in NPOs. They are eager to enter the workforce. This can perpetuate exploitation and reflect some of the neoliberal practices. Many newcomers tend to comply with paternalistic or maternalistic directions, often due to cultural norms from countries where authority figures are typically not questioned. This creates mixed feelings to her. On one hand, NPOs provide a valuable entry point for newcomers to gain Canadian experience and integrate into the workforce. On the other hand, the system may take advantage of this dynamic, using newcomers as a low-cost labor source, which can reinforce patterns of underpayment and exploitation.
If there are more questions or comments from the online audience, we are going to share that with all the panelists, but maybe just pass the mic to our panelists to address the questions or just any other comments. So, because in the interest of time, we are a bit behind schedule.
Resilience, and thank you for that. I mean, years ago, resilience became sort of a flavor of the month, and a lot of then fun, there are a lot of research projects that were funded, and resilience Access Alliance has participated. We have this project of, the resilience of newcomer youth who've experienced pre-migration trauma. And, and the question is, looking at resilience in a way is like accepting status quo, because just saying, okay, how do you support people to be resilient within a context which is oppressive, discriminatory, so on and so on and so on. And so I like your positioning of resistance. Yeah. And how do we get there? And, what you said about dogs, it's because we're positioned in this competitive way. And I bet it was that same government who said, if you actually advocate against us, you will be defunded. So, I mean, resistance, all for it.
Yeah, I mean, just to answer that question about solutions, I mean, there's two levels. One, obviously, we talked about the political level, but I think what we also need to do, part of it is advocacy, but what we're finding that we need to do more and more is not just advocacy, but also model solutions. So one of my things about the current Liberal government isn't so much that it didn't want the kind of answers we that we want. It was because it was incapable for the longest time to attack and transform the institutions that Stephen Harper successfully created in order for those to act as vehicles to meet the outcome that has turned out to be almost like a false propaganda thing. And so if we go beyond thinking that there was bad intention, in fact there was good intention, then we have to be able to figure out how to support in this particular era the creation of institutions and programs that support that progressive change. So one of the things that has really come out of the city of Toronto that I think for me is a big plus is in the affordable housing, they have created for the first time in a long time a program that specifically focuses on funding nonprofits and providing nonprofits, even in partnership with developers, that position of being the primary steward. In other words, the money will flow through the nonprofit, all the grants will flow through the nonprofits, and the tax exemptions and so on will flow through the nonprofits, more so than they will through the developer industry. And that's an example of an institutional change that begins to recover some of the lost ground that we need to have. There's a whole bunch of other things that we're involved in with the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of young, energetic people in CMHC, for example, that want to see real results, but have been blocked by this cultural cloak and inertia of the past, and helping them and working with them hand in hand to create solutions that work internally within their bureaucracy is a much more positive thing to do than to assume that they have bought into that culture. And there's tremendous inroad because of that demographic change within the institution that we can work with and get something back out of it.
I'll just quickly say, I think that the climate change is going to galvanize all of us in ways that supersede poverty issues, settlement issues. All of it is going to all look pretty minor, I'd say, in 5 years. And we'll all be needing to use every advocacy trick in the book, every resistance trick in the book to get governments and market to address really the absolutely catastrophic disaster that's coming at us.
Yeah, obviously change, I think, comes through crises, and climate will be a big one. But one needs to organize before that, because if it's just a vacuum, as Brian was kind of suggesting, that's a disaster. And the sector is really, I think, important in this, but it's more of a safe haven, right? It's not a revolutionary vehicle, the way, because the nature of it. But people need to politically organize. But those kinds of changes generally come out of the result of reactions to crises. And obviously climate change is going to be a big one. I think we're at the end of our time. I wanted to thank everyone. I did want to remind everybody that we are, Ted's future depends on the sale of books. Actually, we gave away
0 cents on every book.
We did give all of our royalties away to Fernwood to help younger upcoming writers. We are not making any money off the book, but would sort of invite people to do that online. It is discounted. Online, there's also I believe a discount code. So please do that. There's also lots of snacks back there. So please help yourself to some of that. And then, yes, and I'm just going to pass this over to Zhixi.
Thank you so much. Very insightful and informative sharing today, and especially on behalf of the center. I really appreciate this opportunity to bring together people working in the front line, people who understand the nonprofit sector, because this is a space where we connect academic researchers, students, scholars with our community representatives to really elevate the voices and amplify the voices from the nonprofit sector. And in conclusion, I think one thing I've been thinking about, as our amazing speakers have already talked so much about the pressing issues from funding to HR to the increasing demand, especially in today's political environment. we talk about duality of despair and hope and precarity and resilience. But as I can see from this book, I just talked to Ted and John before the event. I said, look at the colors. I see a sense of hope. I can even see the fireworks sparkling there. I think one very important message I'm taking away from the discussion here is, what does that mean for our future generations? The future generation of scholars, students, practitioners, policymakers, and what would you suggest? Make the suggestion for us. We talk about Maureen, you shared that wisdom with us, like the dish in one spoon, with 1 spoon chili. We take what you need and leave some for others. And Axelle, you talk about nothing's new now, but how do we actually challenge the status quo? And Mwarigha, you talk about human resources deficit, especially talking about the need for the younger generation to actually get more inspirations and aspire to community services. If I'm asking you as a final concluding remark here, what would you suggest for our future generation? Just one word or one sentence, one suggestion, one action item, just one.
Buy the book.
The only thing I can say at this stage is that there's a sense here that I agree with, and the need to continue this discussion, but also deepen it. And that includes a lot of aspects that John and I didn't address, maybe partly because we're so old.
What did you say, Ted?
I'd say not-for-profits can be and will be a solution. So people should be encouraged to be part of them.
I agree. And I want to encourage, all of the younger generations to talk and to, I'm learning to listen more and more and more every year. Professionally, I try to listen more and more because new voices, it's the new voices. So be, the new voices, let's be the new voices.
I think in the housing field, what I say to young people, and hopefully it's to put a fire in their belly, is we have a housing crisis, but for the most part is your crisis. So do something about it. And stop looking to, I go to this developer conferences and young people are trying to figure out how to solve the problems of the big developer companies in order to return to the market. And my thing is, you have enough creativity. You're more educated than most of us at this point in your life. You have way more access to superb sources of knowledge and networks globally. Use them. Use them. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's give our speakers a big round of applause. Thank you.